All right, we didn't have to do any icebreakers today to get people talking to each other. I've got a little echo, so okay. I don't know who's in charge of the sound, but we'll figure this out as we go along. I'm Bill Bowling, and I'll be the convener and facilitator today. Welcome, everybody, back to the Regional Housing Forum. Didn't know who would show up. Some folks are going to be online and still in their pajamas. For those that did show up today, it's good to be back. I never got used to doing things online, but we did keep the forum going. So, thank you. We've got a pretty complicated setup today. So, some of us are here, some of us are going to be online. We've got some recordings. We've got a professor from Berkeley that's going to be online. We've got some people in person. Got 7 different speakers today, and I think a very, very important topic that's emerging as both an issue and opportunity for the city. I want to begin by setting some context. And I want to do this, always begin with some context, but I think because we haven't been together for some time, it's particularly important today. We weren't meeting because of COVID. And I hope everybody's vaccinated and boosted, and we're all getting out. For people that need to wear a mask, please do. And for others, be comfortable, do what you need to do to be healthy. I want to take this moment to recognize the times, or particularly the time that we live in. It's a time when violence is on the increase, a time when we have not provided safety for our children, a time when attacks on the other, on people of color, of different religions, of immigrants, of Jews, has been dramatically increased, a time of war and conflict around the world, a time when our political system seems to be impotent to deal with the issues that we deal with every day. I mention this at a housing forum because through the years, how we provide affordable housing is a tool for how we build healthy community. And that is the theme of today's housing forum. How do we build healthy communities? And we're in our probably 35th or 36th year of having this conversation. We're an all-volunteer group. And I think it is increasingly important that we come together, not to call each other out, but to create a safe place, to try to figure out how we build healthy community. I also want to congratulate Anna Roach, who's the new CEO of ARC, and they're our host and partner of the Housing Forum, have been that for many years. Anna was the COO of Fulton County and did a great job in getting the eviction relief money out, so kudos to her for that. I just met with her last week. She's recommitted to keep that partnership and to help promote the work that we're doing. I also want to recognize all the work that was done to bring us together today. You'll notice we've upgraded ourselves a little bit, bigger screen, better sound system. We just hope it all works. But if you'll be patient today, and if we have glitches, work with us. If speakers don't show up, I'm going to depend on you to have conversation or ask questions. So let's proceed. And I want to thank the folks that are not in the room but are also online. We are here in this place, St. Luke's Episcopal Church. And it's important that we're here. This is really where I began my ministry, starting the first community kitchen for the homeless here. The task force for the homeless started. The food bank started here at St. Luke's. many other ministries, and they've had a strong history of being the host and being a supporter of community conversations. So I want to invite my pastor and minister and the rector of St. Luke's, Winnie Vargassi, to welcome us and to say a few words. Winnie, thank you for letting us be in your house. Thank you.
Good morning. And we're so honored that so many of you can be here in person, and welcome to everyone that's watching watching the hybrid meeting. As Bill has said, and Bill is we're very proud that Bill is a member of this church. This church and this space have hosted and kind of incubated some of the great work in service and justice in this city. And we who are here in this generation are very honored to be the stewards of that. So do know that as you're scheming for what is next, we're happy to help convene if that's something you need. That's one thing we know how to do. We can convene and we can feed, and we got parking. So please do know that you're welcome, wherever you come from and whoever you are, you're very welcome here. We're a Christian church, and I am here in Atlanta from New York, and so I'm still figuring out how to do this in spaces that aren't Christian. This city is more Christian than I'm used to. So let me welcome you, and let me invite you to recall the beloved community that we are called to build. This city has called out the nation, the beloved communities that can be ours, the partners that we have, those that are in need because of structural injustice in this world and not by any real fault of their own, even as we question the idea of fault at all, and who should be unhoused or why anyone should have housing insecurity. I would invite you as a faith leader to put on your most imaginative hats and imagine the city that can be together, because we cannot build what we cannot imagine. We are so honored by your presence here, and we too are thinking about how we contribute. Bruce Gunter won't let us forget that we too have a role here at St. Luke's in the property that is ours to do our part and to do the right thing for who we can become as a city. So whatever your faith tradition is, or if you have none, the one thing we might all have in common is we are called to imagine greater than is. And most of us have something in us that has called us to this work, some moment that called you to it, either a personal encounter or something else. But whatever it is, I invite you to call it up so that your work together may be truly visionary and that we can offer something in Atlanta that could be a model for our country. Welcome. The washrooms are that way. It's probably the most important information you need. If you feel like you've got to walk out this way while people are talking, you can go that way as well. You end up in the same place. And if there's anything any of us can do that work here to help you while you're here, please do feel free to ask us. Welcome.
Also, George wanted me to remind each of you in the audience online that all the slides, all the presentations we have will be online. You can access all those. I think they've already been sent out to you, but if not, you can find them there. All right, let us begin. The American dream, by any definition, includes the belief that one can work hard and achieve financial success. That's been our narrative through our history. This aspiration is most often connected with the dream of home ownership. For the majority of low and moderate income households, home ownership is the most common way to grow financial independence and wealth. But in today's environment, there are many issues disrupting the American dream, and housing is only one of them. Today, we're going to take a big picture look. We've got economist John Willis here from the Federal Reserve Bank to kind of set context. You'll get a presentation that some of you may have access to, but we thought it was important to really get that context and look at where we are. We're then going to pivot to another issue that is increasingly concerning to housing advocates, and the issue of private equity investor activity in the single-family housing marketplace. It's the corporate landlord issue you're hearing more and more about. Now, we have no problem with private equity and investment and capitalism. That's not our issue. What we're going to look at today is the right balance where those decisions are made. At the core of this issue, the concerns of equity investors are buying up single-family homes and converting them to rental in such a high concentration. And they are squeezing out those who hope to become home buyers. There's also concern about how these players treat their renters with frequent and substantial rent increases, the addition of new fees, and the growing trend of entire communities built for rent is only increasing our concern. On the other side, we'll hear from those who say this is the American free enterprise at work, and in fact it is. And it's the new dream. It's about property rights and about the market meeting demand for rental property that isn't being met everywhere. And as you know, a theme of this housing forum is how short we are on affordable housing and built units. And it's only become harder during COVID with supply issues. So we're going to address this conversation from as many angles as we can. We won't solve anything today. That's not our goal. Our goal is to provide you with information, to encourage you to dig in deeper, to learn more about the issue, and if appropriate, to encourage you to take action. So first up, please welcome economist with the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, John Willis. John, thank you for being here.
All right, good morning, everyone. I'm happy to be here. The first thing that's important, I have to set my watch, is you have to tell an economist when to stop. Otherwise, we'll talk all day long. But in my time today, first up, I provided I'm going to use a few of my slides today. I provided a longer slide deck that I think has been emailed to everybody. So I wanted to provide a comprehensive view of what's going on in the economy. I'm going to highlight a few of those elements for the macroeconomy, but really want to focus my context of how has the macroeconomy development in combination with what the Fed is having to do to try and hit its mandates on promoting stable inflation, how that's interacting this year with what we've seen in changes in the housing market. And then I'm also going to end, if I have some time, with a little food for thought in terms of longer term perspectives on how housing fits into wealth formation and creation across different segments of the economy. So to dive in, what I want to highlight at the theme is that the Federal Reserve System, it has two jobs that Congress has given us. It's to promote maximum sustainable employment and to promote price stability, which the Fed over the years has interpreted as 2% inflation. So what I want to do is kind of highlight those two pieces. Right now, the employment piece I'll start with, which is a key component for people to be able to afford houses, is to have good employment options. That part is looking good, and then as everyone knows, on the price side, the inflation piece is not looking good with the changes in the past year. So I'm going to highlight a few of those pieces, and then that will lead me into what role particularly the housing has fit into that dynamic for the macroeconomy. So as a quick kind of overview or sketch of where are we at in terms of the pandemic, where we had an initial 2-month period where the economy had subtracted about 20 million jobs. We'd never seen that quick of a downturn, but that was because it was a shutdown period. People were at home. People stopped engaging in the service sector. We lost those 22 million jobs. We have almost, so in the next month or two, we have almost recovered all of those jobs. Sure. And where this shows that in terms of the kind of the recovery piece, initially just shutting down the economy for those 2 months and then reopening the blue in 2020, we got about half of those jobs back. They were just shut down temporarily. But then the orange, particularly over the past year, we've added 7 million jobs over the past year, and that's a pace of about 500,000 jobs a month. That is kind of historically incredibly fast. That has been incredibly important for getting households back engaged with the economy and having strong income growth, which is the labor income growth is the fuel for our economy going forward. But as we've seen in all the different phases of the pandemic, it has been very uneven in how it's been felt across different groups, different sectors, different industries. And this is one particular, there's many ways to look at employment. This is one chart I've used in the past to look at shifts by jobs, by technology and other aspects. But what I've done here is I've just divided jobs into 3 different categories by occupation. And the highest line is occupations in the kind of categorized by the census as professional management occupations. So those are jobs that typically require a college degree. And you can see everything's indexed to where it was before the pandemic. There was a little decline in the blue line. It then recovered and now it's above. So in those sectors, and those are largely the ones that are able to remote work, they were able to pivot more in the pandemic. And then if I shift to the orange line, which had the dramatic, those are occupations that are kind of designed to service occupations. So it's not just the service industry, but service occupations across all industries. And these are typically lower paying occupations. And you can see the dramatic decline because that was, a lot of these jobs are in the leisure and hospitality industry. So they've been impacted the most. We have seen some recovery, but even if you look at now, still quite a bit of a gap between the other occupations. So that's the other part of the uneven, the people that were kind of least prepared to weather a pandemic in terms of having lower income, they've been the most hurt, and we haven't seen all of those employment opportunities recover at this point. The other piece that's very different across industries is we're hearing a lot about wage growth. Wage growth looks very different depending on where you're at. And here's where I'm showing industries, and they are ordered ranked by their average wage. So the lowest wage of these industries is leisure and hospitality, but the blue bar is showing the wage inflation, wage growth over the past year, and that's been growing at 12%. So you've also seen, as you go out to restaurants and things, they're short of workers, there are a lot of opportunities there, and they're seeing faster wage inflation, and that's varied across other industries to different degrees. So we are seeing strong wage growth in particular in some sectors, and that's been driven by the demand and the recovery of the economy. So then in terms of, it's hard to pick one wage growth, so I always show several. These are all different ways of measuring the wage growth, and this is where you can see it in aggregate. If we just look overall, these are all different measures, but showing the same pattern, is that in 2021, as the economy more fully reopened, you saw that wage growth as labor demand is strong broadly across the whole industries. We've seen that wage growth accelerate. It's starting to come down a little bit, but still remains very elevated. So that part is saying that there's a lot of demand for workers, a lot of opportunities for labor employment at higher wages. But the part that then I'm going to use this to tie into, so this is part of the challenge that businesses are facing as their wage growth grows up, and then this is just one quick slide to see their costs of goods. This is producer price index of different services. The line that keeps going up and down a lot that you can think of as raw materials. So all the commodity supply chain issues you've been hearing about, we keep waiting for it to, oh, we're going to kind of solve supply chain issues. Well, every time we see that, we see another surge, and this is showing like the last 3 months following, in part, not totally, the implications from the Ukraine war in terms of gasoline, food, other aspects. We're seeing another surge. So we're not seeing a stabilizing of forces that are going to lead to kind of slower inflation, which is what the Fed is focused on. So if I add up that strong wage growth that firms are facing for labor costs and their goods prices, this is then the challenge front and center for the Federal Reserve, is in terms of trying to promote 2% inflation, which if you look before 2020, these are different average measures. The blue line is the last 12 months and the orange line is averaging over the past 5 years. Prior to 2020, everything looked pretty stable around 2%, even a little bit below. And since that time, obviously the blue line is now above 6%. There are different measures of consumer price inflation, but they're all elevated. And this is the part that the Fed is now, as you see in the newspaper every day, the Fed is saying they're going to adjust policy to try and promote this coming back, because in the long run, having stable prices is good for households. It's good for thinking about buying homes in terms of mortgage rates, other aspects. So this is front and center for the Federal Reserve. So to highlight a few pieces and then to go into housing, so most of the time, most so far has seemed mostly positive for households because employment's good. I showed you wage growth, but I also didn't take into account, well, what does wage growth look like once you subtract out the inflation? And that's what this chart is showing. So this is using that same wage data that shows wages are growing 4 or 5%, but for the average household, their costs are rising even faster. And this is the piece that we're definitely starting to see signs and hearing in the news is incomes are growing at a slower pace than costs, and that is squeezing all households, but that also means it's most likely to squeeze the low to moderate income households the most. And so you can see on kind of different average measures, real wages on average, this is just for the whole economy on average, have been declining, in terms of your ability to buy things is down 1% to 2% relative to a year ago. The other piece that's showing up rapidly in the data is that there was, in terms of looking each month, in terms of how much total income households get, which would include your labor income plus transfers, and we had a lot of positive fiscal stimulus during the pandemic to help households. That, I even had to cut off the access, that drove the savings rate during those times very high. Well, now that we're coming out of that and most of those fiscal programs have ended, the savings rate has been declining, and in particular, if you look at the last couple months, it's now down below where it was kind of over the past 10 years. So this is another aspect of the dynamic that's happening in the economy, where there's opportunities to go out and get the income from labor income, but in terms of the other supports during the pandemics are mostly coming to an end, and now the impact of higher prices is what's causing the squeeze on households. So I think, so the last piece then, transitioning, and then in terms of what does this all add up to in terms of thinking about inflation overall and how the Fed is going to have to respond to interest rates, which will take us to the housing market. The one part that has driven a lot of the costs, and here I'm just splitting inflation into the two main categories, or consumer price inflation in terms of goods versus services, and we certainly saw the costs of goods, the blue line, that's the part we had a shortage and supply chain issues. That is likely to be more on the temporary side, I mean temporary being 3 or 4 years, but you can see prior to the pandemic, goods inflation is typically around 0 in terms of, because of technology improvements. That goods inflation over the next couple of years is likely to come down and be less of a force for overall inflation. But the challenge is core services, that is 2/3 of the economy. That includes medical care, includes housing services. That's the aspect that when that moves higher is typically much more tied to labor costs, which are high, and much more likely to be persistent. So that's the challenge that's going to be lasting longer, and that takes us into housing. So the biggest part of consumer services in terms of pricing is, and this is the nerdy part of the talk, is that they try and figure out how do we measure the cost changes in services of housing, and they call that owner's equivalent rent. And so that is not trying to capture the change in the value of the asset for housing, but just in terms of the services people get, the value of having a house and living in it, separated from that also the value of having an asset as an investment. And so here you can see the dramatic increase in that over the past year to the point where it's at the highest level, as high as it was in the early 2000s in several periods. So this is the part in terms of that comes to the Fed's door in terms of saying, what are issues tied to pushing inflation higher? This piece about the services part coming from housing, owner's equivalent rent, that's a challenge. But the broader challenge facing households is, well, if you actually then, this is the same line, so I switched colors, but the blue line is now the orange line here at a different scale, and now I'm showing also, well, what are just happening to housing prices? So owner's equivalent rent piece, that's going up 5%, but as we all know, the housing market is going up dramatically higher. The data came out yesterday is a second month in a row of over 20% increase nationally for housing. So to hit another couple quick indicators, as I go through. So now in terms of kind of with that scenario, the Fed is now saying with its policy, it needs to try and promote inflation to come down. So it does that through moving rates higher. So this is one piece in terms of reflecting that the Fed controls a very short-term interest rate called the Fed funds rate, but that then transmits to longer interest rates such as the 10-year Treasury, which I'm showing here is the blue line. And then that is, you can see, it mirrors very closely the 30-year mortgage rate is very closely tied to the 10-year Treasury. So communications by the Fed that it's going to have to ease up on the accommodative policy it had during the pandemic, that's transitioned to mortgage rates in the red line going up by about 2 percentage points over the past 6 months. So that's kind of one phase in which the Fed, in terms of if you want to think about what's the Fed's job, is demand is up here and supply for labor, for housing, for everything is here. The Fed wants demand and supply to come together, and we would love for supply to increase, but we all know limitations on supply not happening. So the only other way is to try and be less accommodative in terms of kind of having financial conditions tighten up a bit to try and slow down the demand side. And in terms of what has that meant for, I was going to show one in terms of just where are we at in terms of thinking about housing starts. And I should have prefaced multiple times, I'm not a housing expert. I think people in this room have a lot more housing expertise. But from the macro story, these are kind of the charts we would look at to say is, what is construction looking like at the aggregate level across the country? And you could at least say the positives are that construction was very slow, obviously after the financial crisis, and we were falling behind on keeping up with housing. So housing starts have been at the highest rate in the past 15 years, and multifamily's been coming up. Obviously know that that supply is not keeping up with demand, but that is at least starting to make some progress. The other part is in terms of what is happening in the shifts in the last couple months as mortgage rates have gone up. So these are two measures of looking at the monthly supply, and the blue line is the one that has the longer series, the monthly supply of new houses. Well, as rates have gone up, the housing market has started to cool, so you see a larger monthly supply. The orange line is kind of looks a new series that doesn't go back far. That's monthly supply of existing homes. That's at a lower level, but the new homes for that market is slowing a little bit, again, tied to changes in terms of mortgage rates. And then the last two pieces I wanted to show is in terms of saying for Atlanta, so the news, I probably don't need to preface it, the news is even worse in Atlanta in terms of costs. So these are just, one measure is saying, back to that, trying to measure what's the service cost of housing in Atlanta separate from the asset value increase. This also is looking like the imputed amount of services cost for housing is rising at about double the rate of the nation from this calculation. So for the nation, housing services that people need have gone up about 5%. For Atlanta, it's gone up about 10% in the past year based on their calculations. And then similarly, the overall house price index, so 20% was high, and Atlanta is growing at an even faster rate. So the last two things I wanted to show, this is more in the food for thought, and then we'll take any questions. One thing I've been looking at in terms of at the Atlanta Fed, we've been having a lot of conversations the past 3 years about looking more closely at saying how do we look at differences across different segments of the economy, looking across wealth and incomes, across dimensions by gender, by race, by ethnicity. There's one particularly really good data set I've always wanted to look at from the Federal Reserve Board where they do the survey of consumer finance. And what this provides is it's a comprehensive survey done every 3 years, and then they are able to kind of supplement it quarterly. But it gives the best view of consumers in terms of wealth generation and how those are changing over time for different households. So there's, on one hand, there's too many numbers on this chart, but I'm gonna try and highlight just a few. And what I did, and this is again, just food for thought where I just started looking, I said, well, the data can go back to about 1989. And what you can see is you can look at households by white, black, Hispanic, and other. And the part I was just looking at, and we can look, actually I'll just focus on 2021. The first part is I didn't know really what to expect, where the distributions, and we talk a lot about families and households having their wealth grow from real estate, but I didn't know the different pockets. But if we focus on just the bottom, and if you look at different categories and say maybe focus on just the real estate line at the top, you see the number that stands out in terms of the disproportionate is Hispanic households. A lot of their wealth, 44% of their wealth, based on this measure, is held in real estate. So that's a large concentration of their wealth relative to the other categories, where for black households it's 28, and for whites it's 21. So that's just the facts of where people have their wealth. But then if you look at different other aspects that I'll get to in terms of what has kind of contributed to wealth generation, if you focus next on the third line is corporate equities. So if you think of the stock market, there you see also some big disparities, where for Hispanics, just 4% of their wealth is in equities. For black households, it's 6%, and for white households, it's over 25%. And so in terms of those pieces are saying, okay, for white households, they have more wealth in the stock market. And then the other one I thought was interesting that I hadn't thought as much about in terms of wealth generation is they also are able in the survey to ask how much of their wealth is in their kind of their pension entitlements. And that's where you see also big differences across different households, where particularly for black households, nearly 40% of their wealth is tied up in their pensions that they have for their retirement. So for those, I was just thinking about, well, given that differences and just the facts, what does that mean? And you might kind of guess, for the growth from 1989 to 2021, you know, we typically think about get your house, that's where your wealth will grow. Well, this is showing from the data is like how much did those assets grow at an annual rate from 1989 to 2021? And here you can see, so the real estate, kind of the housing story, so that saw an average growth of about 5%. But then in terms of thinking about kind of wealth disparities, wealth inequalities, and that growing gap, you can see that for the stock market, that growth was nearly double in terms of how we've seen people have their wealth in different places. The growth rates then kind of magnify some of the differences that are out there. And then my final slide, and then I'll pause for questions, is again, this is more just trying to say, well, what's the main contributor to looking at wealth growth across these different groups? And so you can see in terms of starting, say, just real estate, so in the housing is accounted for in the orange bars for Hispanic households, nearly half of their wealth creation over that almost 22 years, almost half of their wealth growth has been through their housing, less so for blacks, and then the least for whites. We kind of know the story for the stock market, so the corporate equities piece, the blue bar, for white households, that's where their wealth has been generated. So this isn't good or bad, but just kind of trying to understand the facts and the perspectives, thinking about the role of housing and other aspects. And I'll pause there and love to take any questions across any of these topics.
So the economist knows to stop talking as I start walking toward him. I hope everybody feels better now. I would say for those that can't balance their checkbook, we are called economists here.
We're called the dismal science. So,
is there any questions in the audience? We're going to do this briefly, but any clarifying questions? Marissa will bring a mic.
Warmer in here.
Can I make it warmer in here? That's on you, man. Huh?
That was on George.
All right.
Anybody?
There's one in the back. And just give us your name.
Hi, I'm Sherry. My question is about the pensions and how much it's growing for the black community as a share of their wealth, but how all I've heard for the last 20 years is how pensions are, non-public pensions are, going bankrupt, getting liquidated. So those numbers look actually pretty horrifying to me. Comment?
yeah, so my comment would be, this is meant to be food for thought. So your thought is exactly of saying if say in this case, black households have counted on pensions for their wealth, think of one generation to the next, for the next generation, that option is not likely to be there. And so that's similar to what I've thought. I've done much more work on like employment. But if your whole family was working in the manufacturing industry and you want your kids to work there, but those jobs aren't there anymore, that also is going to be a similar challenge. So I totally agree with your point of saying the next generations aren't going to be able to count on this. So what can be done to help them generate wealth going forward?
Let's do one more from the audience.
Do you have any stats on like locally owned, like small investors versus corporate investors? Because I saw that stat and I thought it was saying one thing, but then it actually said something else.
Yeah,
it's more like where your wealth is, not necessarily
yeah,
where you invest.
So that's where I'll do a plug for my colleagues. So Ann Carpenter is in the room. Ann, raise your hand. So I would encourage you to talk at the break to Ann Carpenter. So she's in our community economic development team in the research function, and she would definitely be more likely than me to have a good answer to that. So I think the stats are out there. I'm just not up to speed in that area.
Okay, George, any questions from our online audience? Jack Murphy? This is where we're still practicing.
Yeah, it's at the bottom there.
Okay. On slide 19, any idea of the price points of the increase in housing starts? Good news is we're getting an increase in housing starts, but the bad news is we have a long ways to go.
Yeah, so I think that's going to be, I think my answer will be mainly that's going to be a key indicator to watch closely over the next couple months and next year. So as mortgage rates have gone up, that's going to affect a lot of people's decisions in terms of the housing. So I think on one hand, you would think that might put a little downward pressure on housing starts, but the flip side is we're so far behind, I think that still means there's going to be a large backlog. So I would say maybe some slowing in housing, but demand still exceeds supply, so I would expect that to continue to grow.
Okay, I think we got one more question from the online audience. And not seeing it. How does leverage play a role in these returns?
So I think they're referring to the wealth piece,
Yeah.
and that's the one where I will just kind of defer from the standpoint of I was just showing their equity values and how they change. I don't know from the details of the survey how leverage played a role in some households, if that helped them acquire more. So that's a great question, and I don't know the answer to that one.
All right, there you go. Thank
There you
you. That's usually my answer around economics. I don't know the answer to that good question. All right, we're going to pivot to kind of our lead topic today, the involvement of equity investors in the single-family rental market. We've asked two experts, and two good ones, who are studying this issue and to share some of their findings. First, we're going to ask Brian Ann, assistant professor of our own Georgia Tech School of Public Policy. Brian has studied this issue locally. And then after Brian, we're going to bring up assistant professor Desiree Fields at the University of California in Berkeley. And I'd like to say she's up early this morning to join us live. She studied institutional investors in this space throughout the United States. Her recent report identifies Metro Atlanta as the largest target of equity investor acquisition of single-family homes to convert to rental properties. You'll see this in some of her slides, is that while this is happening around the country, Atlanta is the biggest target for that. So let's begin. Professor Ann, thank you for being here.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for inviting me. I'd love to share my research. Okay, so in recent years, as I will walk you over, we've seen a lot of increase in private equity firms' investment activities all over the nation. And as Bill has said, we hear lots of anecdotal narratives about the addition of their fees, code violations, issues with tenants. But I think one of the most important outcomes we want to first examine is home ownership. So whether their investment activities pushes out certain layers population out of the market. So that's what this research paper is about. Okay, let me start with broader background in the real estate market. Probably you all are more expert than I am. But regardless of the investor size, after the Great Recession, we see the constant increase in the investor activities in the housing market. And of course, 35% of the most of the activities is for single-family housing. Now, in recent years, whether unlike individual home buyers who are more vulnerable and subject to macroeconomic conditions, those who are purchasing the home for investment purpose, they have been very steady. Of course, there have been some downs over the years due to pandemic. But compared to them, individual home buyers, you see they are more robust. And when we look at them by their size, the large size investors here, you see that their activities are constantly increasing, whereas mid-sized investors who hold 10 to 19 properties, it has been quite plateau. And small-sized investors who have less than 10 properties, of course, their activities in recent years during the pandemic has decreased. So if we break down the investor by their size and their scale, large-scale investors who have more than 100 properties, the pandemic was the opportunity for them, to make investment and seize the profits. Now, this is from Washington Post, And Atlanta, for some reason, maybe because of its general appeal for housing affordability, vibrant urban environment, and business opportunities, has been the hottest market in the country for the investors. But some skeptics may say, well, if you look at market transactions, yes, they purchase at 20% or 25% or 25%. But if you look at the stock, it's just a few percent. It's just a few percent of entire single family rental stock. Whereas most of them are held by the mom and pop investors and individual home buyers. So many people say, we don't think it's a level where we should be worried about it yet. But here, that may be true at the aggregate level, at the metropolitan or nation level, but what if we focus on the neighborhoods? Because at the neighborhoods, we could observe much higher concentration of home purchasing by large institutional investors, and it would also show us greater variation across both time and space. And it's the geographic level where we live that matters to quality of our life as residents. So this is from 2021, December, Washington Post. They looked at one specific county, Rutherford County, which is southeast of Nashville metropolitan area, and this is Lavon City. And all these red dots are the single-family housing properties held by Progress Residential, the same private equity firm, one of the largest players in the nation. Now, if you look at one specific subdivision, among 19, 11 in a row are owned by the same private equity firm. Now, we are not talking about D.R. Horton or other front yard, those companies. This is just one. Next time when I present my research, Nick, who is a great student researcher at Georgia Tech, working with me, and I will present it in Atlanta context. Okay, this is what we calculated using core logic market transaction data from 2007 to 2016, which is our study period. Now, HHI is Herfindahl-Hirschman Index that shows the overall levels of market concentration. Now, it includes every type of investor, individuals, small-scale investors as well. You see that it was very low, and then it increases, and it peaked in Atlanta in 2013. And then it somehow decreased, but still higher than the recession level. Now, if we only look at large institutional investors who purchased more than 50 properties in any given year of these years, yes, it's much higher, and the average shows, the peak shows that 12% of, by the way, this is at the census tract neighborhood level, on average, 12% of the stock in certain neighborhood were purchased by large institutional investors. Now, that's only the average. What if we look at the spatial distribution? This is 2007 HHI, and if you look at here, now you may not be able to tell the color, but there are lots of red pockets, higher concentration in the inner city in 2007. But if you look at the scale, the highest category is up to 8.08 out of 1. 1 meaning fully concentrated market. Every property's market transactions done by one single private equity firm, for example. If you look at 2013, now you see that you don't really see the investor activities, their concentration in the inner city, but it's U-shaped surrounding Atlanta. And the scale is very different. Now, highest category is between 0.31 and 0.85. It's highly concentrated in certain neighborhoods in the metro Atlanta. If we only look at more specifically the percent of home purchases done by large institutional investors, in 2007, you don't really see any noticeable activities. Now in 2013, which was the peak area in my study period, the same patterns, U-shaped, and it goes up to somewhere 40% to 76%. meaning that let's say there was 100 properties on the market in your neighborhood, 76 of them were purchased by large institutional investors in certain neighborhoods. Now, this really pairs well with other researchers' analysis. So, for example, Charles studied 5, I think, largest private equity firms between 2013 and 18 using CoreLogic data. And you see the same patterns here in the later years compared to mine. And in Washington Post released their another analysis, which looked at 2021. This is, I believe, all types of investors. But you see the market concentration, the investment concentration surrounding Atlanta. And I can tell about these neighborhood characteristics later during the Q&A, but these are majority African American resident community. Home values are slightly lower than the median value of the rest of the Atlanta metropolitan area, and less poverty, and more recently built housing post 2000 compared to other average property in the metro area. Now, at the same time, home ownership rate decreased starting from 2007 and 8 to 2016 or 17 by about 6 percentage point. And Atlanta Metro is not the exception. But one of the another interesting point is that while household income in real dollars has rebounded starting from 2013, home ownership rate was not so. It kept decreasing. So my question is there implication of institutional investors purchasing or market concentration for this dampened home ownership rate? So the first question I ask is, has a conspicuous rise of large institutional investors as a new asset class in single-family detached housing market dampened local home ownership rate? Okay. I will briefly walk you over the data. We use census data, and we also use CoreLogic real estate transaction data and these records. And we calculate large institutional investors' activities and medium-sized corporate investors. And we compare their, how they play their role differently in terms of home ownership rate. And we control for lots of usual suspects that predict home ownership rate of any given neighborhood, including the frequency of sales in that neighborhood on that year. Now, working with these records is messy, especially if you are interested in who buys and who owns what. It has lots of typos, miscoding, name variations. It's very hard. But Nick and I have found very easy and efficient way with which we can help your analysis as well. So we use open source software package called OpenRefine. What it does is that it normalizes and tokenizes the textual data based on their linguistic or phonetic patterns. So for example, you see here lots of different names, different names of D.R. Horton, LLC. So instead of an analyst going over all of them manually, the software automatically recognizes the patterns and sorts them in clusters. And you can repeat it until you get satisfied. And without having any deep knowledge about machine learning or algorithm, anybody can use it. So that's what we use here to work with this massive over 1 million transaction data after data cleaning. Now, another thing is that many institutional investors use different LLCs, or subsidiaries, or shell companies. And using buyer's name and their mailing address together and Georgia's Secretary of Business Registry data, the software easily allows us to identify all sorts of different subsidiaries. For here, we tried just one, Invitation Homes, and there are at least 49 different LLCs in Georgia for Invitation Homes. Now, this is for Invitation Homes, the largest private equity firm of the nation, but we can do this for any scale of investor, mom and pop as well, because we can use buyer name and mailing address. Yeah. So that's what we do. Now, after this process, between 2006 and 2017, we were able to identify large institutional investors who have purchased single-family detached home 50 plus in any given year of the study period, over 10 years. Now, if you look at here, they are really largest private equity firms that everybody knows these days. But some of them you may not have heard of. If you are the realtor, you may have heard of their names, but I was not aware of some of these names. For example, if I look at Pacific Group LLC, I went to their website. They have their rental stock everywhere in the metro Atlanta. And in Fulton, these are the list of their development or the properties in their inventory. So because we are focusing on Atlanta, I think it is important to identify the large-scale institutional investors in the local context, which would be missed if you only look at the national scale. So that's what we do, and we do some regression analysis. And let me go visit the first question. Has a conspicuous rise of large institutional investors as a new asset class in single-family detached housing market dampened local home ownership? Now, these are all control variables, but you only really need to look at these two rows. Here, what it means is that as an average neighborhood gets sees fullest concentration of market transactions, the property transactions, they see 3.5 percentage point decrease in their home ownership rate. Of course, you never see the fullest concentration, so that's quite extreme case, but there is an effect, and this is an average effect for 1 year. So if you multiply by 10 and divide by only looking at the average, I think it can go up to 4 to 6% decrease, which aligns well with the national decline, the level of national decline, or Atlanta, even Atlanta context. Okay, now if we just look at large institutional investors' purchases, basically we see the same result. So the answer to the first question is yes, there is implications for dampened local home ownership rate. Second question, what about medium-sized corporate investors? Because they could be a kind of counterfactual for large institutional investors. People can argue that, hey, large institutional investors, there's no problem, it's market transactions, everything is fair. But what if we don't see the same result for medium-sized corporate investors? What if this is really the story of large institutional investors? That's what I'm trying to examine here. Okay, so here, this is large institutional investor purchase, and this is a medium-sized corporate investor, meaning 10 to 49 purchases. In the first column, this is the result you just saw from the previous slide. Now, in the second column, I only examine the effect of medium-sized corporate investor purchases. And there is no statistically meaningful result in the second column, meaning that they don't really influence local home ownership rate. But in the third column, when I include both, you might think you need to account for both players' presence. Then basically the same. Large institutional investors dampens home ownership rate, whereas medium-sized corporate investors don't. So this is really the issue of, or story of scale. When it is investors who are really large scale that consistently or at a large scale purchases the properties, then we really see that drop down in the home ownership rate. Whereas it's not the case for medium-sized corporate investors. So the answer to the second question is no. Now, the most important part of my research presentation, who gets pushed out? So here what I'm doing is I repeat the analysis, but first just looking at the home ownership rate of non-Hispanic white, and separately the home ownership rate of African American, black. Okay, so in the first column, if you look at the Herfindahl-Hirschman index, in the first and third column, whether we look at Herfindahl-Hirschman index or the share of large institutional purchases, there is no star, meaning that there is no statistical effect. Okay, and the magnitude is very small. Whereas if we look at black home ownership rate, you see lots of stars and the magnitude is big, meaning that as your neighborhood gets entirely purchased by large institution investors, you would predict to see 10 percentage point decrease in your home ownership rate of your neighborhood. So that's what it shows. And it doesn't matter which measurement I use for investment activities. So the question for the answer for the third question is black would be home buyers. And it's not really surprising if you think about which types of neighborhood they target. As I said, it's majority black, relatively lower median house values, but also lower poverty area, but recently built homes, neighborhoods. Okay, then the natural sequence, next question to the third question is, are the distributional negative effects asymmetrical between non-Hispanic white and black home ownership? So here, let me walk you over this. This is the effect on black home ownership rate, and this is the quantiles of the distribution of home ownership rate of the neighborhood in the entire Atlanta metropolitan area. And you can see the big numbers here, meaning that as you look at the neighborhoods where there is lower levels of black home ownership rate, the negative effect of large institutional investors is much greater. And that negative effect gets smaller as you go to the neighborhood where there is higher percentage of black home ownership rate. Now, if you look at non-Hispanic white, essentially the magnitudes are not really comparable. Even at the 90 percentile, the effect is only like 3.5 percentage point down compared to 7 percentage point down. So effect size is much smaller for non-Hispanic white home ownership. More importantly, there's no statistical power here. So this dotted line should be close to 0 to be statistically meaningful, but that's not the case here. Whereas if you look at here, you can see that the dotted line is very close to 0 here. So there is some statistical evidence that this is really the story, the effect, the negative effect for black home ownership rate is substantial, much higher and asymmetrical compared to the effect of non-Hispanic home ownership rate. So the answer to the first question is yes, and it's much more strongly for black home ownership. Now, so let me summarize my research findings. So the first question I asked was, okay, is there really empirical evidence that this is large institutional investor who has contributed to the decline in local home ownership? Yes. And they are not the main, maybe they are not the sole contributor. There are other demographic factors, but they are one of the factors. And that's not the case when we look at medium-sized corporate investors, but this is really the story of the effect from large-scale institutional investors. And who gets pushed out from the market? Black would be home buyers. And such negative effect is much stronger for black communities and for the neighborhood where fewer proportion of African American residents have home ownership. So let me conclude here. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. We're going to shift to Professor Fields in Berkeley, but let me say this has been quite technical so far, you've noticed. I'm not a technical person. I have a hard time finding an old email I sent 6 months ago. So it was important to understand how we're getting this data. And oftentimes when you're before an audience and you start talking about hard things to talk about, you often get accused of, Bill, you're just emotional, or you really don't understand the market, or you really don't have the right context. So we've spent a lot of time today, and Brian, thank you so much for adding how hard it is to get this data and the methods you're using. I think it's been very helpful. So I want to shift now. George, your Professor Phil's coming up. And I've got you on the small screen. So welcome to our regional housing forum here in Atlanta, Georgia. Thank you for getting up very early this morning. And you're going to give us more of a national perspective. Again, I want to say that the study that she has, which is a large study, is online, and I encourage you, it's 60-some pages. I really encourage you to take some time and read it and get to know it. So welcome to the Housing Forum.
Thank you. Really happy to be here. And yeah, good morning. Thanks so much for inviting me to speak on this important topic. My research looks at the intersection of financial processes and digital technology in the housing market. And so a core focus of my work has been the role of institutional scale operators in transforming the single family rental market since the 2008 crisis. So today I'm going to be zooming out. Brian gave us a really amazing deep dive, super rich data analysis. And my work is going to provide some broader context for the role that corporate landlords are playing in Atlanta. And I'll be discussing my recent report, which draws on SEC filings and earnings calls to study single family rental real estate investment trusts. And apologies about the poor lighting on my end, very California problems. It's super sunny here today. Okay, and just a note about terminology. So I use the term corporate landlords to refer to institutional scale operators in the single family rental market because they control portfolios of tens of thousands of homes. So let's move on. So single family homes, of course, have long been a meaningful share of the rental market in the US. But before the 2008 financial crisis, institutional investors had virtually no presence in the SFR market or single family rental market. It was highly fragmented, dominated by small players. But this all changed in the wake of the crisis. Large pockets of discounted but newer houses were available, mortgage credit was constrained, and rental demand was rising. So in 2012, as this article in the New York Times details, these market conditions had large investors, quote, salivating at the opportunity to buy thousands of homes at deep discounts and fill them with tenants. But it was very much an open question whether this asset class would get off the ground and whether landlords would be able to efficiently manage these large rental portfolios. Of course, today, SFR is very much an asset class and one that has drawn interest from institutional investors, home builders, and apartment managers. Advances in technology were a crucial linchpin that allowed corporate landlords to capitalize on post-2008 market conditions by scaling up acquisition, using algorithms for that process, and coordinating property management through digital platforms. And as this recent profile of real estate broker AJ Stigman highlights, local actors have also turned out to be vital intermediaries in the construction of this new asset class. Just last year, Stigman helped institutional investors buy or lease more than 300 homes in the Atlanta metro area at a total value of more than $86 million. I don't need to tell anyone at the Atlanta Regional Housing Forum that Atlanta is a crucial locus of institutional ownership. The four largest corporate players collectively control over 25,000 rental homes in the area. Before the COVID-19 pandemic began in spring 2020, the corporate SFR industry had somewhat stabilized. So the industry had gone through this period of rapid initial growth from around 2011 to 2014. And then from 2015 to 2019, large players like Invitation Homes got bigger mainly by just acquiring or merging with smaller players. And then despite initial concerns that the pandemic would cause a housing downturn, it turned out to spark a surge of demand from investors and owner occupiers alike. As a result, since March 2020, more than 60 SFR deals in excess of $50 billion have been announced. This has facilitated a new wave of acquisitions and development. This pandemic boom in single-family rental has attracted substantial interest from state retirement systems for teachers and other public employees. It has drawn in new players like home builders and commercial real estate investors, and it has financed build for rent as a new growth strategy amid rising prices for a constrained supply of existing homes. Digital platforms that purport to simplify and democratize SFR investment for individual players have also drawn capital. However, existing large players really hold an early mover advantage, and they are poised to benefit the most from investors' interest in SFR. On earnings calls, Invitation Homes, American Homes for Rent, and Tricon Residential all characterized 2021 as a banner year for fundraising, with more and more capital seeking exposure to this new asset class. Private equity and alternative investment firms also remain central to the market. Blackstone is back in the SFR market in a big way after exiting its investment from Invitation Homes in 2019. Freddie and Partners, RS Management, and LaSalle Investment Management have all expanded their presence in the SFR market during the pandemic. And so, considering these vast amounts of capital pouring into SFR, it's an important moment to step back and consider, what do we know about the role of institutional investors in the single-family rental market? So, as Brian detailed, corporate landlords are really kind of notoriously challenging to study because these operators acquire properties through opaque ownership vehicles such as LLCs and trusts. In fact, Atlanta is one of the few cities that has a strong knowledge base on the geography and the practices of corporate landlords due to the efforts of researchers like Elora Raymond, Dan Immergluck, Suzanne Lanny Charles, and of course, Brian Ahn. So my research took a different approach. I'm not a numbers person. And so the approach that we took was to ask, what can we learn about corporate landlords from their SEC filings and their earnings calls? These are publicly available data, and they offer insight into corporate power and corporate framing devices, as well as concrete information on corporate strategies. So we sought to understand the growth and the operational strategies of corporate landlords and what they mean for renters and communities. And overall, the key takeaway from this research is that the emergence of single-family rental as an institutional asset class signals a growing power imbalance in the housing market. And so our policy goals should really revolve around rebalancing this market power. Okay, so moving on to what we found in our research. Let's start with the market footprint of corporate landlords. According to our research, the largest public and private operators of single-family rental homes collectively control about 250,000 homes. Freddie and Partners, which is a private operator that's not included on this map, owns about 80,000 properties. So I've included them in the 250,000 figure. So a common refrain by SFR operators and their trade and lobbying group, the National Rental Home Council, is that this market footprint represents a vanishingly small share of the market. Of course, this way of framing market share obscures that the institutional SFR industry is not evenly distributed throughout the country, as you can see from this map. A snapshot of the holdings of Invitation Homes, American Homes for Rent, Tricon American Homes, and Front Yard Residential show us a very distinctive Sunbelt geography. And as you can see and are probably already aware, Atlanta is the metro area where the most SFR homes are controlled by the landlords that we studied. Like others, so why Atlanta? I think the way that I understand this geography is that like other Sunbelt metros that institutional investors have been drawn to, Atlanta was hit hard by the foreclosure crisis and the ensuing decline in home prices, but it was also positioned for recovery because it had undergone substantial economic growth in the last decades of the 20th century. So for investors, the steep devaluation of relatively new family homes in Sunbelt metro areas was really a once-in-a-generation opportunity. And of course, what this map doesn't show is the finer grained geography that Brian showed us so eloquently, right? When we drill down to a more fine-grained local analysis, other players than the ones I studied also emerge, and corporate ownership becomes kind of visibly concentrated in particular parts of the metro area. So not evenly distributed across the country, not evenly distributed within particular metro areas. So while all of the landlords that we studied got their start due to the opportunity posed by the 2008 crisis, today the supply of distressed properties is quite limited, and the competition to acquire existing homes is heated. Nevertheless, corporate landlords have been able to pursue growth in this market context, often by venturing into new approaches for building scale quickly. So looking at Invitation Homes. Invitation Homes has largely maintained its tried and tested acquisition channels. They've acquired homes one by one through their proprietary tech platform, Acquisition IQ, and they've waited for opportunities to scale either by merging and absorbing smaller portfolios or securing bulk purchase agreements with developers. In 2021, Invitation Homes deployed $1.95 billion to acquire 4,800 homes. This is more than double the number of homes they acquired in either 2020 or 2019. So they've really ramped things up. The firm is also scaling up through new partnerships, including a new joint venture with real estate private equity firm Rockpoint Group. This joint venture will deploy $750 million on higher price point SFR homes in premium location, perhaps a reflection of how the market has moved during the pandemic. They've also undertaken a partnership with builder Pulte Homes to build 7,500 homes for rent. Meanwhile, American Homes for Rent has really deployed an aggressive build for rent strategy. When the firm began implementing build for rent, or BFR, as a growth channel in 2017, they mostly purchased homes through third-party developers, and they experimented a bit with building a few houses themselves. However, today, in-house development is their core growth channel. In 2021, American Homes for Rent added 3,291 homes to their portfolio, and about 40% of those homes were newly constructed properties from the company's in-house development program. Next year, they aim to deliver 3,000 to 4,000 build-for-rent homes. And finally, Tricon Residential's growth strategy. Tricon has positioned itself as serving a middle market demographic and focuses on acquiring older homes, about 20 years on average. But they have also recently launched their own build-to-rent platform through a $450 million joint venture with the Arizona State Retirement System. Tricon now owns 7 build-to-rent communities and expects to add 15 to 20 more over the next couple of years. So let's turn to operational strategies. We found that corporate landlords pursue revenue growth through driving up rents and costs for tenants and through cutting down on their own costs. So in terms of rents, all 3 publicly listed single-family rental landlords, so Front Yard Residential has dropped off of the data at this point because they were taken private when they were acquired by Party and Partners in 2020. So if we look at the rents and rent increases of Invitation Homes, American Homes for Rent, and Tricon Residential, we can see pretty substantial increases last year, quarter by quarter, particularly in the second half of the year. So this chart shows blended rent increases nationwide, which combines new leases and lease renewals. Invitation Homes, which consistently charges higher rents than other corporate landlords, also pushed the highest rent increases. Across their portfolio of 82,000 homes, last year Invitation Homes was able to drive up rents by 14.4% on new leases and 6.7% on lease renewals, so about 8.8% blended. And in an investor call, they shared even higher rent hikes in markets where they have the biggest footprint, 30% in Phoenix, 29% in Vegas, 21% in Tampa, and rent increases of 20% in Atlanta. In terms of other ways that corporate landlords seek to pursue profits, they're really looking to use fees and also to recover expenses from tenants, so kind of charging for ancillary services on top of monthly rent payments. Starting in 2020, ancillary revenue became a major component of Invitation Homes' strategy. Ancillary fees include charges for late fees, move-outs, pets, pest control, landscaping services, smart home appliances, and other miscellaneous services. Invitation Homes is on track to secure ancillary income of close to $30 million annually by the end of this year. Ancillary fees are also a growing part of Tricon's business model. The firm has a dedicated ancillary revenue team that continuously offers new services to residents. In an earnings call at the end of last year, Tricon noted that revenue from ancillary fees increased by 42% from 2020. This is because they were able to resume collecting late fees that had been suspended due to pandemic restrictions, and also because they rolled out new smart home and renter insurance programs. Tricon aims to increase ancillary revenues by 30% per home in the next couple of years. And finally, tenant chargebacks feature prominently in the metrics of American Homes for Rent. Tenant chargebacks are a way that landlords recover expenses that they deem to be the responsibility of the tenant. This might include things like emergency plumbing services or emergency locksmithing services or bulky trash pickup. Last year, tenant chargebacks accounted for almost 16% of the revenue generated, of the core revenue generated by American Homes for Rent. This amounts to about $178 million. So they are seeking to increase the costs that tenants shoulder, but corporate landlords are also working to cut their own costs. So they seek to cut down on the cost of doing business in a few key ways. Across the board, all corporate landlords are using technology to reduce friction and to make operations more efficient and cost effective. This ranges from the design of build-for-rent homes to acquisition algorithms to snap up homes off the MLS, as well as maintaining properties and tenant relations. However, I want to zoom in on property taxes here. Property taxes are a crucial focus where landlords or corporate landlords seek to achieve cost savings. Property taxes, of course, constitute the largest share of operating expenses post-acquisition. And this is especially the case in the context of strong home price appreciation that we've seen during the pandemic. So corporate landlords are employing in-house legal and financial teams dedicated to appealing property tax assessments as a way of controlling costs. And as the CFO of American Homes for Rent mentioned in an earnings call last year, the firm plans to, quote, leverage our robust appeals machine to make sure we aren't leaving any dollars on the table, end quote. So these are some of the operational strategies that corporate landlords are using in order to continue sort of expanding their bottom line. But it's important to note that their consequences are much broader than the tenants that they affect directly. So first, SFR operators are acquiring land and control over development of new rental opportunities as the build for rent model ramps up. These landlords are responding to rising asset prices by buying more upchain, gaining access to raw land for development. This consolidation of land, technology, and power threatens to double down on unsustainable development models in the face of the climate emergency. Second, despite advancing rhetoric of investing in communities, corporate landlords undermine security and stability of communities. Research in Atlanta found that large corporate landlords are far more likely to pursue eviction than smaller landlords, particularly in neighborhoods where most residents are Black. Second, although they emphasize the proximity of their properties to good schools, as I just discussed, corporate landlords actively seek to minimize their contributions to the local tax base that funds public schools. And corporate landlords also undermine community security and stability through using their financial clout to organize against efforts to expand tenant protections, such as a 2018 effort to include single-family homes in California's system of rent control. The third broader consequence of corporate landlords it relates to their equity mining of communities, which, as Brian just showed us really clearly, their equity mining of communities interferes with opportunities to build intergenerational wealth. And this is particularly true for Black residents of Atlanta. For people hoping to buy homes in the places where corporate landlords are amassing the most properties, a mortgage, a modest down payment, and the emotional considerations involved in choosing a family home simply can't compete with all cash offers made within hours of a property being listed. And the wider social anxieties provoked by the market power of corporate landlords provide fertile ground for predatory investment and rent-to-own business models. And we've already seen a kind of newfound interest of venture capital firms in funding rent-to-own companies. So we should, kind of keep our eye on those companies. So just to end, far from sparking a housing collapse like the one that enabled corporate landlords to begin building their portfolios, the COVID-19 pandemic ushered in a housing boom. The pandemic has demonstrated how corporate landlords hold an advantage not only in the context of a market dislocation like 2008, but also under strong market conditions. Today, 3 corporate landlords control portfolios in excess of 50,000 homes. What does it mean for the rest of us when a handful of landlords have so much power? For regular people, the structural advantage enjoyed by corporate landlords amplifies the inequalities that are endemic to capitalist housing systems. So, what can we do about it? I argue for 3 policy approaches to rebalance the housing market. The first is to foster greater transparency of property ownership and rental practices. As you can see in the list of LLC names at the left, and as you saw in Brian's presentation, corporate landlords typically own properties through corporate vehicles such as limited liability corporations with often obscure names. These ownership vehicles effectively shield them from public scrutiny and responsibility and from independent research. Requiring property owners to report the names of beneficial owners and also implementing rental registries would enable researchers and policymakers to study the business practices of corporate landlords and to respond with appropriate local measures. The second policy approach is to implement broad-based tenant protections. The data discussed in this report and the wider context of a rental affordability crisis point to the need for nationwide broad-based tenant protections to limit rent increases, ancillary fees and fines and chargebacks, and generally to promote the security of tenure. The nation appears to be transitioning away from mass homeownership and toward a rental market increasingly marked by corporate entities as property owners. These changes should compel the state to intervene to shift the power imbalance between landlords and tenants. The property rights of landlords should not take priority over the fundamental role of housing in supporting life, safety, and welfare. And finally, we should consider breaking up the market power of corporate landlords. In addition to broad-based tenant protections, policymakers should consider limiting the market share of corporate landlords within individual metropolitan scale markets. A handful of key players have very large footprints in a cluster of metropolitan areas, mostly in the Sun Belt. This concentration of ownership puts corporate landlords in a position to shape the operation of local markets in ways that further strengthen their hand. To foster a healthier mix of ownership and tenure within metropolitan scale real estate markets, legislators and attorneys general should look closely at ways to break up the market power of corporate landlords. So I will end there. Thank you so much for this opportunity to share my work with you.
Ask Desiree if she has any insights on that particular question.
Sorry, I wasn't able to hear the question, so.
are you seeing policies and pushback from a neighborhood level and then from a small local level against institutional investments?
This is the next part, the next panel coming up, so we hope to get that answered. And it is a key question. How do we localize it? We'll take a few more questions in the room.
Good morning, everyone. Candace Mitchell, Enterprise Community Partners. So earlier on in the pandemic, I've heard strategies from affordable housing investors about purchasing properties to hedge against the types of predatory institutional investment. Are you aware of any concentration of ownership that has a focus on affordability, or basically that's the question?
Either one of you want to answer?
Desiree, have you heard the question?
No, unfortunately, no. And I think, when I started this research many years ago now, that was one of the big challenges and frustrations that was voiced by community development organizations and community land trusts and groups like that, was that I think in a lot of ways what we're seeing is the legacy of the policy response to the 2008 crisis, which of course prioritized the needs of investors and financial institutions more so than the needs of homeowners and communities. And so I think what a lot of those community development organizations experienced in the aftermath of 2008 was they were not able to take advantage of the price discounts and the kind of like the inventory of homes that were on the market in order to expand their own holdings, and they were competing with institutional players. And so I'm not aware of any sort of concentration of ownership by affordable housing organizations that have been able to hedge against institutional players. And of course, institutional players are able to move much more quickly in the market than a lot of affordable housing organizations are.
Take a few questions. I'll come back. We're going to take a few questions from our online audience. To date, have any municipalities attempted to curb institutional investor housing purchases through policy? Have there been any successes? This is going to go to the next panel, and we'll start answering that as well as a video we have. So I'm going to defer that and hopefully get some of those questions answered. George, is there any from, okay, Lena, can cities like Atlanta require corporate landlords to build more affordable housing with the city's stipulation? Is there a policy answer to this about requiring more affordable housing?
Brian, any idea? Well, I'm not so sure. I don't see why not. Certainly there could be some, tensions between state authority and local authority, and I know that next panel is geared for that. But if, and only if, the city officials is aware of this massive scale of, concentrations, investment, and if we really think about kind of smaller geography, neighborhood, or the census tract or zip code as the geographic unit where the investment can, where we should think about the concentration investment, then I think it is worthwhile to revisiting the available policy framework or instruments to put some requirements. I think that's definitely probably the steps for going forward. But right now, lots of discussions is focused on, metropolitan level estimates or figures. That's, if that's our constantly focus, then, concentration is pretty low. So I think we kind of need some shift of paradigm, the mindset from higher aggregate geography to lower geography. Then if city officials see these patterns and the empirical evidence on the effect on local home ownership rate and other social outcomes, then I think we can have some policy discussions.
So I love when an audience is jumping ahead of you. The questions that we thought you would ask is going to be on the next panel, and part of the question is where should the decision be? The state, at the local level, at the municipal level, the county level. We're going to get into that because that really is a question of the day. There's one more in the room, and I'm going to take one more from the online audience, and now we're getting to the point where I'm going to ask you to stay a few minutes longer, just because we're getting into more questions. Yes, sir.
Hey there, Jeff Koski, KB Advisory Group. Curious if you see some of the same issues in the concentration of corporate ownership of multifamily rental housing. It strikes me that our multifamily rental housing is very concentrated by corporate investors, and just curious if we should be trying to make comparisons between the two.
I think the numbers, and you may know better, Brian, that there's huge, the Posts and the Amleys and so forth, but the majority is owned by mom and pop folks, small investors. Is that true, Brian?
No, for multi-family apartments, yes. The large corporate landlords have lots of ownership. And so that has been over the years, so nobody has questioned it. But I'm aware of one study which studied Manhattan, and they measured this ownership concentration at the neighborhood level, and they found that the increase in the multifamily building ownership by large corporate landlords likely increases rents in their neighborhoods, which is not surprising. But there is at least one study. And right now, Nick and I are working on not just single family market, but also multifamily market. So next time when you see us, we might have the answers for Atlanta. And another interesting topic would be spillover effect. If we see lots of concentration in single-family housing market, is there any spillover effect to multifamily buildings rents? Because two could be interconnected.
Can I just add to that briefly, just to say that we have also, yes, multifamily housing generally nationwide has undergone a process of consolidation of ownership since roughly the 1990s. And we've also seen a new wave of private equity investment over the past 10 or 15 years. And we have seen aggressive rent increases, right, that are tied to, the kind of earnings expectations of investors. We've seen harassment of tenants, kind of promoting tenant turnover as a way of increasing rents, particularly of affordable properties, older rent stabilized properties, or kind of working class rental housing. So we're seeing some of the same kinds of problems, I think, in both. And I think one crucial difference is that I think corporate ownership and kind of private equity ownership of multifamily rental housing is not likely to also interfere with home ownership opportunities in the same way as corporate ownership of single family homes is.
Please welcome Cobb County Commission Chair Lisa Cupid. Lisa, there you are. And Mayor of College Park, Monaca Motley Broom. Thank you. You guys hardly need to present. We've already got all the questions for you, folks. Okay, I think all right.
I'm feeling a lot of pressure. You keep on saying, oh, the next panel is going to answer all the questions. So.
All right. Well, in the introduction this morning when I began, is we would not answer all the questions and we wouldn't solve it today. We're trying to get it on the table. But, we needed a national context, the economy. We needed to understand the research that's been done. And now we're really looking at what's the impact to the local community. So, Mayor, I'll begin. What's happening in College Park? There's been an impact there?
Everything's great.
All right.
We're just here to chat. No, it really has been one of the defining issues that we've been dealing with for the last couple of years, certainly, but more acutely this year, especially what's been going on with the legislature. And let me just say hello to all the people in the audience who I didn't realize were going to be here, but it's super exciting to see you. And also, so happy to be here with you, Chairwoman Q. It has been in a community where 75% of our residents are renters. I speak all the time about how we are trying to build the community that we deserve. And that is a community in our mind, in the council's mind, of a community that allows for pathways to home ownership. So as we are looking at projects that are coming into our city, we're very cognizant of the fact that we want to boost those numbers. And it's not an overnight thing that's going to happen. We certainly didn't get to this kind of proportion that's, in regard to state statistics, pretty out of whack. I think about on the state level, there's about 63% of folks who are owners. And so we're not going to turn that around and turn this ship around, but we need to look at opportunities that provide pathways for that in the city of College Park. One of the things that I've been so grateful for through the Georgia Municipal Association is the fact that of the 537 cities in our state, we've all got a different story. And the one in College Park is unique. And GMA has been advocating on the state level, and you'll hear from the amazing, incomparable Charlotte Davis soon about their efforts. But we've got to be able, on the local level, because we know what's happening on the ground, we've got to be able to say that there are particular projects that are right for our cities. And this year on the state level, there is some legislation proposed that would preempt our ability to zone for build to rent. And that's really troubling in a community like ours, because we are working so very, very hard to address issues of affordability and continue to provide access for home ownership. Those folks like Michelle Alexander right there, who's done some amazing work for the city of College Park and doing great things elsewhere, knows that this has been a priority for us. So it is a constant challenge. We had a developer who, I'm probably over my time, right?
Well,
I'm sorry.
I want to know the impact in College Park.
Yeah, okay. So,
right?
yeah, so the impact in College Park is we had a development that was proposed, and we've been working through the process, and basically at the last minute, they said, yeah, we're going to switch it to all build to rent. And it was going to be, I think, about 200 plus homes that were going to be for sale. And that happened during the course of this spring. So this is a very, very pressing issue for us as we continue to build the community that we deserve.
So it was proposed as building for sale.
Yes.
Quickly turned to it's going to be rental. We're going to get in a minute, where should that decision be made? But it's had direct impact in College Park.
Absolutely.
Chairwoman Cupid.
Yes. Good morning, Bill. It's
Good morning.
great to be here, and thank you, all of you, for being here. I see one of our city council members, Trey Hutchinson, is here. Thank you for being here today, and I see so many familiar faces. So your question is, what is the impact to Cobb County? And the response is, who's Cobb County? Because as you saw from the map and from the data presented, that a lot of these efforts are targeted to certain populations. And, I can speak personally from living in Cobb for 20 years. My community was one of these communities that was traditionally bought out by investors, and it was happening to me. And yet I found there to be great difficulty, considering my position on my board, to have constructive or in-depth conversation about this. And even moving from commissioner to chair, the topic of addressing affordability is met with absolute controversy. We can't even talk about it. Jessica, I see you. I'm sorry I didn't see you here from our Habitat for Humanity. We've had an election in consideration of 3 new cities in Cobb County, and this was one of the impetus that was reiterated for why we should create our own municipality in Cobb. And, I was just looking at census tract data on Cobb and some other indicators, but you can see it follows race, it follows income. You're going to see these disparities. So yes, they are impacting Cobb. Cobb has just not been best positioned to even begin to talk about it. And so we're becoming increasingly more victimized by these tactics because we are just not prepared to really address it. There's some things that we have done, and I know we're going to get into policy, so I'll wait to respond to that. But I think it's a new day, considering that May 24th has passed, and the majority of our voters said we still like the Cobb County that we've had before, and I think that emboldens me, perhaps some others, to know that we can have conversations around tough topics without people thinking that they need to secede from the county.
Well, thank you. It really is why we have a regional housing forum. There's got to be some place to have this conversation. And when you think you're the commissioner, the mayor, and you think, well, who do I call? Who are we going to talk to? And then some of the strategies of why don't we peel off and create our own city. So it's a tough environment. And it's happening, I think, to our communities very quickly. I want to move, these two representatives could give us many stories, but I want to move in the interest of time to a video. We have been in communication, I have, with Brad Mock, who is head of public policy for the Georgia Realtors Association. 50,000 members strong, a very strong force in the community. Great folks. They're the folks who do the work in the community. And in conversations with Brad, it was challenging for us. We gave him the questions and said, let's talk here. But it was challenging, as it often is, and you make the point, of how do we get to the essence of what we need to talk about, and how do we get to the essence of the issue. So Brad could not be here today, but has promised to come back in the future. But we have a video of an interview that he and I had last week, and I want to cue that up, and then we'll hear from GMA, and then we'll get in a larger discussion with each of us. So if you could cue that up, George.
All right, we're moving on to our agenda, and I want to invite Brad Mock, who represents the Georgia Association of Realtors, into our circle. Brad, thank you for joining us today. You know, we've had a lot of different views, and I thought it was important for you to be here to talk about the position that the realtors have taken around this very issue. So tell us a little bit about who you are, what the realtors do, and then we'll get into the discussion.
Yeah, well, Bill, I appreciate the invitation. I appreciate y'all being flexible and letting me do this as a recording. Thank you. I hope I can be there at some events coming up soon just to be with y'all and maybe continue some conversations. My name is Brad Mock. I'm the Government Affairs Director for the Georgia Association of Realtors. We have 50,000 realtors in our trade association. Our number one priority from a legislative perspective is private property rights, and we work our way out from there. So we're a long way from talking about a transaction or a license law before we talk about private property rights, and that's where we get started. Now, that conversation, it will work its way out into everything from trout streams in North Georgia to build-to-rent communities, like we may talk about a little bit more today, to tenants' rights and things that we've worked on before with tenants. You know, you have to be a licensed real estate agent to be a property manager. So we have landlords, but we really believe in tenants' rights as well. So we're always trying to connect those pieces as they move forward within that realm of private property protection and protection of the of that chain of the transaction there. So thanks for letting me introduce myself, and let's jump in.
All right, and I appreciate that you want to continue to be part of the conversation, because this will not be the end of it. It's really the beginning of this aspect. So we'll certainly invite you back and invite you to participate. The thing we're really focused on today is that we see a trend, as the numbers show us, that almost 40% of the housing stock that was sold last year, at least in the 5-county area, were bought out by investors from out of town, investment banks. We're seeing this a lot in Texas, Arizona, Georgia, the 3 big states, which may reflect a better environment for those investors. Our concern around affordability is that we don't see affordability built into this. And we're not against the market, we're not against investors, but we do want to figure out how do we address this. So I know in a previous conversation we had, Brad, it did come before the legislature this year. You know, you took positions, GMA took positions, local cities took positions, and rightly so, it went to a study committee.
Mm-hmm.
We need to talk about this. And I think what the Housing Forum will do is continue to follow that conversation. From your position as realtors, tell us the position that you took and how it really reflects the conversations we're having about affordability today.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, workforce housing is something we've been interested in for a long time. The Realtor Association is 102 years old. And from a private property rights perspective, we want highest and best use of the land, but folks need somewhere to live. And that's where we want to, you know, continue that conversation moving forward. I think it was 4 years ago now that we had a workforce housing study committee. Vance Smith, Chairman Vance Smith out of the Columbus area, Pine Mountain, chaired that. And we've participated there. And we look forward to participating in this study committee coming out of the House now. Hopefully it'll be seated now that the primaries are over. We'll see who chairs that and how it comes together. But they're going to look at a lot of workforce housing issues and why the affordability is getting lower. As you said, Bill, and I totally agree, it is getting lower. I think build-to-rent communities will be a part of the conversation. I do not think they'll be the entire conversation by any means. There are a lot of issues beyond build-to-rent, but I know that's not our topic today. As far as the legislation that was at the Capitol, you know, the reason we jumped in and supported 1093 as a priority bill for the Georgia Association of Realtors is because of a very simple sentence. And it's an oversimplification, but it's the ice cold truth that an individual owner of a single family home should have the right to rent their property. And the government should not need to put them on a registry of any kind or know that there's a difference between a homeowner or a renter, right? So that's where we entered the conversation. Every piece of legislation down there has a lot of folks involved. You mentioned GMA, ACCG was there. There were other groups that represented build to rent. There were manufacturers involved. There were folks in the construction trades involved because they're trying to figure out costs as well. And there are a lot of people that were watching that conversation move forward. And I bring them up to say, I'm sure they'll be watching the conversation move forward in this study committee as well. So I think workforce housing will stay at the top of our sheet right now because it's the most important issue we have. Affordability is not getting better, right? And the only way to make it better is to try to meet is to try to meet demand with more supply. That's a conversation that's been ongoing. So that's definitely where we kind of enter the room, but happy to go where you want to go with that conversation from there.
So to put a little, and I appreciate that, and I think we all support that, to put a little sharper point to it, when you say individuals should have a right to rent their property, I don't think any of us would disagree on that.
Right.
But when the individual owns 500 homes, not one home, and they're coming in and overpaying and kind of control that part of the market, that seems where the conversation may happen in the study committee and in the larger community.
Yeah, it's definitely where the conversation went before, right? Is that folks are doing it in a concentrated area. For us, from a statewide perspective, the idea that an individual owns 500 homes and they're all for rent, it's not a new one. They're just generally spread out across 2 or 3 counties, right? But you definitely have property owners out there that rent those homes. So part of the question, I guess, is that when a neighborhood meets all of the zoning requirements from a construction standpoint that they are supposed to meet for that county or city, and then they choose to rent those homes, you know, is that problematic? That's a question that I don't have an answer to. When folks have come to me and they've said, well, it's the same thing as an apartment. Well, it's not the same thing as apartments, right? Because apartments have density. You guys know that very well. So it's a new thing. Build to rent neighborhoods, it's a new concept in the market. It only exists, in our opinion, specifically in my opinion, because of the volatility in the market. If we weren't experiencing such a lack of supply, then I don't think Wall Street would be coming in looking for an investment, except that the Dow just keeps tanking, right? None of our 401ks are doing very well.
They've got to find a place for their money. I understand that.
So
but I don't see individuals We don't know any individuals that own 1,000 homes. They may own 1,000 apartments, but we don't know individuals own 1,000 homes or a whole complex of 400. They may, we may not know about them. But the conversation in the study committee,
Yes, sir.
to be as precise as you can be, you're going to be sitting down with GMA, with
I hope so.
local officials, with the realtors, as concise as you can be. What do you think that conversation will be?
So here's what I think it'll be. The speaker will set the members of the study committee. That study committee are members of the Georgia House of Representatives, right? Only the Georgia House. I think they'll meet multiple times, like the construction cost study committee met a couple years ago, and like the first workforce housing study committee met. They will be open to public input. What they'll do is they'll go to Stockbridge, or they'll go to Blairsville, wherever they set the meeting, and they'll say, let's bring some people in and hear from them. Let's hear from some affordable housing advocates. Let's hear from some realtors that want to talk about the lack of supply in general. That's where I'm going to want to be talking, right? Is just the general lack of supply.
Sure.
Let's hear from some folks that do build to rent communities and understand why they need to do them. And let's hear from some mayors. Let's hear from some county commissioners. Let's understand what tools they need to be able to continue to have the local control they want, but not necessarily have to overreach like we've seen and ban rentals altogether, right?
Yes,
sir.
Let me just ask, and we've only got a couple minutes left here. I understand people get invited in. What if someone representing our association of people that are talking to each other all the time, can we invite ourselves to that table, or
well,
do we have to be invited?
I think they'll be public generally. Now, look, I don't get to control it, right? But here's how I've seen them go, and here's how I think it will go. I think there'll be public input. And I know Dale Washburn really well, and he's a realtor, and he cares deeply about this issue. I think he's going to want to hear from citizens wherever they go. And I'll be honest with you, Bill, I think he wants to hear from you right now. Without the study committee, I know for a fact he would love to hear from y'all and hear what you think about the issue and just affordability in general. So I think what'll happen is they'll open some time for the public to listen and to comment, and they'll provide some presentations is what's likely to occur. They'll create a space and say, reach out ahead of time so we can have your presentation. Not a lot different from what I think y'all are doing today that I wish I was there to experience with you, but I think they're going to take what you're doing, blow it up across the state, and look at it multiple times. And I really think it's something that you guys should be just as excited as I am about. They're going to look for answers. I really, truly believe that. They're looking for answers. That legislation, it's gone, right? Let's look for answers. Let's try to figure out how to get this stuff moving forward. You know, we have worked with GMA before together to solve blight issues, to help get single-family residential blight and commercial property back onto the market that was just sitting there. We've worked with tenants' rights groups to be sure that tenants had options to get out of their lease in domestic violence situations. Those scenarios both came out of previous discussions and studies. So study committees do lead to good legislation. I think this one will, and we're real excited about it.
Well, I'm excited about you being here today, although we had to record it. I hope we have you back. I am going to call Mr. Washburn, and I think
I'll give you his number.
I'm telling you, Dale told me to call, but I get that
you tell him.
He needs that input, and we'll give that input.
Yes.
If affordable housing, the thing we're focused on, if it was simple, we would have figured it out over the last 30 years.
You're right.
So every year, there's another facet to it. This is what we're dealing with today. Thank you for being here today. We're going to have you back. I've got your number, so I'm going to be relying on you to keep me informed.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for your time. We are on the same team. I look forward to going down this road further with y'all for sure. Have a great day.
Thanks so much.
Yes, sir.
Being on the same team, but we did have a good interview. That was actually the second interview we did. The first one didn't work. So we did get to his key question from where he sits. Do private owners have the right to rent their property? That's how he frames it. And the answer is yes. I mean, we should have that right. We're in America. But it changes when that owner owns 1,000 of them, as the mayor might talk about in College Park, her goal of trying to get more ownership and build community. Or as Lisa may talk about in Cobb County, where it's hard to even have the conversation. I want to invite Charlotte Davis, who was at the Capitol and a part of this conversation from GMA, Georgia Municipal Association, who does represent municipalities all over the state. And she could give us a little more background on where that conversation began. It ended with a study committee, but it didn't begin with, let's go study this. How did it begin, Charlotte?
Thank you, Bill, and good morning, everyone. Again, I am Charlotte Davis. I'm Deputy Director of Governmental Relations at the Georgia Municipal Association, GMA. And my organization, we represent all 537 cities in Georgia. That's every municipality. And my team specifically represents city voices, mayors, councils, the governmental entity at the state capitol, the Georgia State Capitol. And you can imagine we spend a ton of our time in our advocacy work really making sure legislators understand what we mean when we say local control, home rule, let your local elected officials make the decisions that are best for their community while they're in Atlanta legislating. And we are fortunate to have luck and great relationships at the Capitol. A lot of legislators are former elected officials locally, and they understand that. And of course, there's a handful that represents their own special interest, and that's just sort of the art, not the science of working at the General Assembly. So specific to the build to rent movement, I think our team first came aware of it in January at the beginning of this legislative session, particularly with two bills. The House bill had been mentioned, House Bill 1093, but there was also a nearly identical bill on the Senate side, Senate Bill 494. And we noticed, we know our local government coalition well. We've got the city governments, GMA, ACCG that was mentioned, who represents the counties, housing advocates. We know what our coalition and our partners look like in this housing space because housing is a local issue that we routinely advocate on. But there were a lot of other lobbyists who are very interested in this issue that are not what I would call housing experts or housing experts, honestly, like y'all or I guess officials. And it was, I would say that there were about 7 to 8 other lobbying firms that were interested in this. And that's because, and Brian, your presentation was great in showing the the top companies that are located in Georgia. If you took that list and you laid it over companies that have registered lobbyists in Georgia, it would be nearly identical. And that is something new in Georgia. And that's because, and you all saw the research presented is largely what helped us fight the issue at the Capitol. The companies have focused not only on the Sun Belt, but specifically in Georgia, specifically in the metro Atlanta area. Again, the research shown was perfect to show that. And so as a lobbyist, I'm not at all surprised that there has been a very heavy-handed approach to coming to the state legislature to preempt mayors and county commission chairs and county commissioners and ultimately local residents, right? Because you all represent the local voice and you know what your community needs. It's a preemption of that. And I think, Bill, if I had to sum it up, and I love the way that you framed it, where is this decision best made, whether it is at the state? I think their coalition and the lobbyists that are representing American Homes for Rent, Invitation Homes, Quality Home Housing Options, the coalition they put together, they would say it does reside at the state. And I think that's largely because it's easier to go to the state and ask for a blanket preemption of y'all's ability, local elected officials. And so what I mean by that specifically, the legislation placed a ban, preemption, restriction on any local elected official, governing authority's ability to not just ban build-to-rent communities, new development, but to place any type of restriction or condition, which is anything from permitting to zoning. And we can get further into the policy elements of this. And a couple questions, one in the back earlier was about, well, what role are the neighborhood groups playing in this? They absolutely are engaged. I don't know if y'all check your next door at all, but there are already forums and comments and community boards that are apprised to this and are talking to their local elected officials. And then the other question that popped up, what are cities doing? There are cities that have plenty in the metro area that have addressed this well before the preemptive legislation, that have tried to craft thoughtful ordinances to balance this new model. And again, that gets back to placing rental caps and percentages that they'll allow in their community. We have not been able to find communities that are outright banning the build-to-rent model. It's just they want to do it in a thoughtful way. And a couple other points, if I can quickly. We don't have an opinion on rental subdivisions one way or the other. I think the case could be made that it's going to be an additional tool in the toolbox and done well and done thoughtfully. I think it's going to be really important in the future, and I think there's probably agreement. in the room on that subject. But I think doing it in a heavy-handed preemptive measure through the state, because it's easier to strong-arm y'all, speaking as a lobbyist, it is not the most genuine way to go about it. And I think that is why there were plenty of thoughtful, cooler heads that prevailed that it ultimately did put the study committee forward. And I'm interested in really looking forward to the discussion. And it will involve everyone. Brad's exactly right. These are open meetings. I encourage y'all and your groups to come and be a part of them. We'll certainly be a part of them. But there is a lot more discussion to be had. The very last thing, because I've continually heard the private property rights argument, and I agree it is a gross oversimplification. There are no cities in Georgia that are banning an individual homeowner or landlord from renting out their private property. Cities don't even have the ability to know where those rental properties are because we're restricted by current state law. You can't keep rental registries. That was actually one of the policy recommendations of Desiree, to have a national rental registry. We don't even have that in Georgia. We can't. So there are law changes that need to occur. Tenant protections obviously need to be strengthened. And the build-to-rent model and legislation in this discussion is kind of being overlaid onto already a weak foundation, I would say, for tenant protection in Georgia. I'll stop there. I'm really interested in the questions and to hear more from our panelists.
Thank you so much. And again, it helps to kind of get both sides. Just checking, Councilwoman or Mayor, that wasn't Chairwoman, that wasn't well received that you would have no authority in your local community, that someone at the state would dictate the makeup in the community, that you couldn't put anything. That, am I assuming the right there?
It's just fascinating to me how things oscillate between local control and then these very strong measures of the state. And no, it did not sit well with me, and I took a note of that.
All right. We're going over time some, but I know there's some questions in the room. Marissa, why don't you get here and here? I'm going to ask your indulgence that we're going to go over time just a little bit, but we're getting at the core of the program.
Okay. Melody Kelly. I'm a city council person for the city of Sandy Springs. I just have a quick question. Just a couple of, I was wondering if you can give me a couple of suggestions of local organizations that are working in the tenant rights space, and do they have lobbyists? Okay.
I'm happy to take that. It's great to see you, Councilwoman. Your city has been very involved in the build-to-rent movement, as I know you're aware, and thank you for your support. Yes, they do, and they're our partners at the Capitol. Healthy Housing Coalition, Appleseed, they all have lobbyists at the Capitol, John Waller, Elizabeth Apley. I'm more than happy to connect you to them. Also GMA from the local government side and ACCG from the counties. We all work really closely together. We're in constant communication. And it's not just during the 40 days of the legislative session. It's a year-long thing, and especially with the study committee now. And I know that that's just the tip of the iceberg of people and groups that have been doing this work. Again, I'm just a lobbyist. Y'all are the experts. And there are plenty of people, and the only encouragement that I can give to those groups that are doing that is think about partnering with the local communities, the local leadership, obviously, and then be loud.
Right here.
Thank you very much. Adelaide Steedley with Atlanta Housing. From a lobbyist perspective, where do the mortgage brokers sit on this? Because this seems to be carving out a lot of their business. And if you follow the money, it would seem like they would have a huge stake in the outcome of this effort. And I would also say, too, I wonder if Atlanta has not been ground zero for this because 60% of the city is zoned single family. We have one of the largest proportion of single family homes in the United States already, which is why I think you don't see it in New England and you don't see it in older cities because they have that density. And we're also one of the least dense cities in the country, so we have lots of land to build on. But I'm just curious what the mortgage brokers are doing in all this.
That's a really good question. The mortgage brokers, bankers of interest kind of were on the sidelines, I would say, this past session, and maybe it was because it was new and there were plenty of people like our organization or the realtors that were leading the fight for particular interest. I would have thought, honestly, the realtors would have been on the side of this. So it's an interesting coalition that it'll continue to evolve. And I could see the mortgage brokers getting more interested in it. I think the bankers are kind of going to be in a split situation where traditional home loans and home lending might have been the model, but if there's capital that they can free up for build-to-rent investment groups, there might be a future there that they want to support, much like I understand that the realtors are evolving their business model to be more property managers. I think there's space, again, for all of that. But specific to the city of Atlanta, the Metro Core, I agree. And so this I would not say is really an issue where you're going to wake up inside the city of Atlanta. I live here in Midtown and be right next to a build-to-rent subdivision. It's not going to happen because we don't have the available land. But the cities that we were hearing the most concern from were on the donut. We're out right at the exurbs, right on the edge of the perimeter, because they do have the tracts of land and they're still in a great, lucrative, fast-growing area where these types of new developments can meet the population demand that the cities are dealing with.
I would encourage you to go back to the slides from Pastor Phil's about the article from the New York Times. That broker is doing all the deals. He's making tens of millions of dollars. I don't know why local brokers don't have a problem with that. He lives in Florida. So it's like, there's a lot to talk about here. Here's one from our audience, Griffin. How do we ensure the nuanced discussion around build-to-rent and institutional investment does not become co-opted by old-school NIMBY to enforce homeowner class bias against renters? And we know that's an issue, and actually we talked about it, we didn't get it in the recording, but that was an issue. We talked about local policymakers controlling and not letting affordable workforce housing in their city. That is a tool. That's one they were concerned about. Anybody want to address this question?
When we had the opportunity to testify in front of the House Judiciary Committee about this, and I was with Mayor Paul from Sandy Springs, and both of us were talking about our perspectives on the north end of the county and the south end of the county about this, because it really does impact everyone. I was taken aback a little bit by the realtors' argument that it was this sort of NIMBYism that we were trying to push, because we are doing projects in our city right now that are focused on workforce housing. I see someone in the audience right now. I'm looking at him right there who's doing one of them. And we are deeply committed to making sure that families have safe, stable, decent housing at all levels. At the same time, again, we as a policy priority want to provide pathways for people for whom renting is not the end of the road. And when a corporate investor comes in and buys a large swath of land, I mean, we're 11 square miles, and part of that includes the airport. So none of you can say you have not been to College Park, okay? Because it is part of the airport's actually in our city. But we have a limited amount of space. And so we need to be very careful as we develop to make sure that we really are thinking about our entire community and giving people opportunities to start their careers there, give them great foundations, and have housing at every level for every phase of their lives.
Thank you. I talked to folks last week in Henry County. They have 4 built-to-rent projects before the Planning Committee in Henry County right now. So it is in the donut. It's in Cobb County and Henry County and so forth that we're seeing this. One more question in the back.
Good morning, Sarah Patnod from Tapestry Development Group. I remember 2 years ago there was a study committee for workforce housing where a lot of housing advocates came and talked about how important affordable housing was and really gave impassioned speeches about how we care about affordable housing. But that was not the point of that committee. The point of that committee was to use affordability as a cover for design regulation and preempting, again, local communities from design regulation. How are you going to make sure that this upcoming study committee doesn't do the exact same thing, where all of us will get up and we'll talk a lot about how we care about affordable housing, and they will completely write that off because that's not the point of that study committee. The point of that study committee is, again, to use affordable housing as a cover to preempt the local the regulation of build to rent. So as we are thinking about how we're all going to call our legislators and show up to these study committees, how do we change that conversation so that we're not talking on two different paths and actually be effective advocates for the part of this that is in question, not affordability and promoting affordability, but preemption of these local controls?
I appreciate how you came around to that question because you started out with how are you going to do that and ended up with how are we going to do it. That's why we have this housing forum. It's us that's going to do it. So this conversation will continue. It'll continue with our commissioners, our mayors, with our public policy organizations. One last question. Quickly? Yes.
Thank you, Bill. Quickly is one of my middle names.
All right, and you are?
I'm Steve Carr from Grant Park. And for those who don't know where Grant Park is, it's basically downtown Southeast Atlanta. And I have a question for, actually a comment for Charlotte Davis. You've used frequently the word lobbyist. Well, we're all lobbyists here, every one of us. We're advocates in whatever form that we can get involved with. And then, how can I get back through the front door now that you've built that big fence around the Georgia Municipal Association to find out what y'all's legislative agenda is in the upcoming sessions?
Is that online? What your
It absolutely is, and I will connect with you after this and make sure you're plugged in on our website, our bill tracker. We'll even get you the newsletter once a week during session if you like, because it does have updates of everything we're working on. But we're actually in the process right now of setting our policy agenda and platform. We're a membership-driven, nonpartisan organization. Mayor Motley Broom is actually on our Legislative Policy Council. And we've got mayors from all over the state who are involved in crafting that agenda. And we're going to be in Savannah at the end of this month, or in June, it is June now, actually approving the 2023 proposed policies. But I look forward to talking to you after, and you can look through that document.
And might I add, I'm super, I can't say enough great things about GMA or Charlotte, but in crafting that policy, was it a week and a half ago we were in LaGrange? Literally looking at every single word of every single policy that GMA is putting forth. And so the entire Legislative Policy Council was there sort of drilling down on these issues and making sure that from the perspective of cities that our agenda is really at the forefront.
One last one, and we're gonna wrap it up. Yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Barbara Guillory, and I am with the National Association of Real Estate Brokers and Down Payment Access. Senate Bill 491 was submitted by our Senator, Gail Davenport, who happened to be here today. And we are looking at down payment assistance as a means to create more affordable housing. What are some of the other opportunities that you see for us to be able to level the playing field for affordable housing? Thank you.
Other tools, other opportunities?
It is a big question. In College Park, for our employees, we have down payment assistance, and I think it is a really valuable tool, and we're working with local banks as well to incorporate the educational component of home ownership and responsibilities after you actually own the home. I know that this is, I know we're over time, but
yes.
I'm sorry, but I got the mic. And so one of the things that kills me about this is the idea that you're just putting money into something and you're never getting anything out of it.
I'm going to wrap it up with that.
Okay.
All right. Commission Chairwoman Cupid, any last comments? Everybody can stay and talk more. I just need to finish up. Yes.
Just appreciate the conversation.
Yes.
You know, we do have some tools available. I can't necessarily say for that purpose, but with respect to this topic, I mean, all land use and zoning decisions are discretionary decisions. And we've had proposals for build-to-rent single-family homes. I know one of them did not move forward because the commissioner, myself at the time, was not supportive of that because they're putting those in communities that are already transient. They're not helping us to stabilize those communities. But something else that we've done, and Charlotte spoke to this, is with our land use and zoning decisions, we typically have a cap in there for rental properties. And I was texting my county attorney to figure out what do we do to make sure that cap isn't exceeded. Because it's not so much even introducing the affordable housing, but once somebody gets into that affordable housing, they have that property right to be able to sell that property. So it's maintaining the affordability of it. And we found some properties that began as affordable. They were sold to some of the entities that we spoke about in earlier presentations. So we have some work to do, and certainly could use the support of persons who do think in the policy realm to help us, whether at the local level or the state level.
Commission Chairwoman Cupid and I traveled together on a link trip a few weeks ago, and I know I was facilitating a meeting and came around to her, and we were all kind of finishing up the day, and she said, enough talk, let's have some action. So we're going to continue to talk with each other, but we got to be smarter, we got to pay attention, we got to figure out our different roles. Yes, we all are lobbyists, some get paid, think about it all day, every day, but we all need to do it as volunteers. So let me just say some summary statements to take words out of your mouth, Mayor. When you're renting, investors are looking for a return on investment. No problem with that. But when they're doing 38%, because they'll tell you we only do 2% of the market across the country, but they're doing 38% here. And that return they're getting is the return that we would have gotten had we been the homeowner, right? That is the difference. That's how we build wealth. So that point always needs to be front and center. Short-term thinking, which is the political thing that anybody has to be 2 or 4 or 6 years, you've got to think, how do I get reelected? How do I get something done? Is always in tension with long-term thinking, which is the knowledgeable planners who are connecting the dots. And the planners in each county or city are bringing that information to the policymakers. And that's a tension that we live with all the time. And to say that policymakers are under a lot of pressure, that is not an easy job. Brad's comment that the marketplace is the key driver. Well, that is true. And how the economy is doing has offered opportunities for investors. But it's also had an effect on whether we can build healthy communities where people can live where they want to live and get to work and have good schools. The key question, do people have a right to rent their property, or is it a bigger question than that? Institutional investors are meeting a market demand. The smart money is being invested there. It could be our money if we've got retirement savings. We're invested there. So it's a good investment, but it may not be a good investment for the local community, and there lies the tension. Does greater supply equal more affordability? Again, Brad's point. Does it? Not necessarily, we have found. What is the right balance between rental and ownership? That's the tension that we're in today. Local control versus state control. That's what we talked a lot about today, and that's going to be the conversation at the Capitol. How does it affect stabilization of neighborhoods? We know the answer to that after today's presentation. Let me thank a number of people who have made the Housing Forum possible today. The good folks here at St. Luke's and the folks that have been doing all the technology. Wow, I'm just glad we pulled it off today, folks. I didn't think half of it would work. All the mics work, the tape worked, I want to thank, as I always do, George Bergen from ANDP. ANDP of itself. George is what I call the producer of the program. We were still talking last night at 9:30 trying to pull this thing together. We have a steering committee. A number of you in this room are on that. We talk all the time with each other to figure out the topic for the next forum, be September the 7th. We have an advisory board, again, with some of you in the room. I encourage, if any of you want to be involved in that process, please let us know. This is a volunteer-run effort to create a safe place to have questions about hard things. And as I begin today's forum, we're in an unprecedented time of lack of trust, of hating on each other, of defining the other as the enemy, and where we live, whether we can have a safe home and a safe place to take our kids to school, where we can trust each other and start respecting the diversity of the community is the key question of the day. Thank you all for being here today. I want to thank the online audience. Advisory board's up on the board, and I hope to see you in September. God bless.